The house was cheap, and that was the only reason I took it. I'd just moved back to Ohio after a few years away, looking for something affordable while I tried to get back on my feet. The neighborhood was quiet and felt safe enough, with old trees lining the streets and a few kids playing outside on weekends. The realtor told me it was a fixer-upper, but nothing major, just some paint and minor repairs. The basement was unfinished but dry, or so they said. When I first toured the place, the basement had that musty old smell you'd expect from any house that hadn't been lived in for a while. It was dark, the ceiling low, with exposed pipes and wooden beams. The floor was concrete, cracked in places. A single bare bulb hung near the stairs, but the switch was faulty. The realtor joked about the charm of it, but I wasn't sold. I promised myself I'd seal the basement off mostly, just use it for storage and laundry. The first few weeks were normal enough. I moved in, painted a few walls, fixed up the kitchen, and started settling into the routine. The basement was cold, colder than I expected, even during the day. I thought it was just the old foundation and the lack of insulation. Sometimes, though, I'd catch a faint smell down there, something sour, almost like rotting fruit mixed with something metallic. I told myself it was just the smell of old pipes or damp concrete. One night, a few weeks in, I was up late folding laundry in the basement. It was about 11:30 p.m., and the house was silent except for the hum of the furnace. As I bent down to pick up a sock, I heard it. A soft, dragging sound, like something being pulled slowly across the concrete floor behind me. I froze. The basement was pitch black beyond the light from the single bulb which flickered occasionally. I strained my eyes but saw nothing. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaky. No answer. I grabbed the flashlight I kept nearby and swept the beam around the room. There was nothing. No signs of anything moving, no shadows, no animals. But the smell was stronger now, that sour, metallic scent. I told myself it was just my imagination and went upstairs, locking the basement door behind me. That night, I slept fitfully, the sensation of being watched prickling my skin. The next day, I found that a few of my boxes in the basement had been shifted. Not moved far, just nudged to the side. I chalked it up to the old house settling, or maybe a draft. But that night, the dragging sound returned, this time louder and closer. Over the next week, the sounds increased in frequency and intensity. Sometimes I heard low whispers, too soft to make out words, but unmistakably human voices. The temperature in the basement plummeted at night, so cold that I could see my breath. One evening, when I was cleaning the basement floor, I noticed strange scratches along the concrete wall near the old furnace. They looked like letters, but the markings were rough and uneven, as if someone had clawed at the surface with their nails. I ran my hand over the scratches, and the chill that ran through me was immediate and intense. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. Every creak and groan of the house made me jump. At around 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of soft tapping coming from beneath the basement floor. It was rhythmic, slow, deliberate. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, sweat on my forehead. The tapping continued for several minutes before fading away. I decided I had to investigate. The next morning, I went back to the basement with tools to try and pry up the section of concrete floor where the tapping had come from. It was cracked and uneven, as if it had been damaged long ago. After an hour of work, I managed to chip away enough to reveal a small cavity beneath the floor. Inside, I found a small wooden box, old and water-stained, but intact. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a bundle wrapped in cloth. I pulled it out carefully. It was a baby's shoe, tiny and worn, along with a folded piece of yellowed paper. The note was written in shaky handwriting. "Please forgive me." I felt a cold sweat break out. I called the landlord immediately and told him what I'd found. He hesitated, then said the house had been in his family for generations and that some things were better left buried. But I insisted on calling the police. A few days later, forensic experts arrived to investigate. They excavated more of the basement floor and found a small hidden compartment beneath the concrete. Inside, they discovered human remains. A child's skeleton, tightly wrapped in the same kind of cloth as the baby's shoe. The coroner's report said the child had died decades ago, probably around the 1940s. There was no record of any missing children in the neighborhood from that era. The police opened an investigation but hit a wall quickly. No leads, no suspects. After the discovery, strange things escalated in the house. The basement temperature became freezing cold even in summer. Lights flickered and went out. I sometimes heard crying, soft, sorrowful, coming from below. One night, I woke to find the basement door slightly ajar, even though I was sure I'd locked it. I never went down there again after that. Eventually, I moved out, unable to live with the oppressive atmosphere. The house still stands empty, and I hear from neighbors that the lights flicker inside at night, and sometimes you can hear a baby crying softly, though no one lives there. I don't know what happened in that basement, but I'll never forget the smell of damp earth, the cold, and the tiny shoe in that old box. Sometimes I wonder if the child is still waiting down there, trapped in the dark. Story, the end. I moved into that house in the fall of 2019. It wasn't anything special. 2 stories, brick-faced, built sometime in the late 70s in a quiet wooded suburb outside of Columbus, Ohio. The price was suspiciously low, but the inspector found nothing significant wrong with it, and the previous owner had already cleared out everything. I was starting over after a rough divorce and needed the space and solitude. The house had a large basement, which I figured would be good for storage, maybe a small workout area. I didn't think much about it at the time. It started with noises. About 2 weeks in, I'd hear a low thump at night. Not frequent, just every few nights. Sometimes it sounded like someone dropping a small bag of flour on the floor below. I chalked it up to the old foundation shifting, or perhaps a rodent problem. It was fall after all, and animals look for warmth. I set traps, but nothing was ever caught. No droppings, no chewed wires, just that dull thump. The basement had a smell I couldn't quite get rid of. Musty, metallic, like old blood and wet stone. I cleaned it top to bottom, opened the narrow basement windows to air it out. Still, the scent clung to the concrete like it had soaked in decades ago. The floor had odd stains, too. Most were dark and could have been anything. Spilled paint, oil, old rust from a shelf, but some patches felt sticky, even though they were dry. One morning, I was in the kitchen making coffee when I noticed something odd. The basement door was cracked open. I always shut it tight. My cat, Milo, loved sniffing around down there, and I didn't want him getting into anything dangerous. But he was just sitting near the basement entrance, staring down into the dark. His tail puffed out, ears flat, but he wouldn't move. I nudged the door shut and told myself I must have left it ajar by accident. Still, I remembered hearing the distinct latch click the night before. That night, I dreamed of that basement, but it didn't look like mine. It was wider, deeper, and darker. In the dream, I was standing at the top of the stairs, but the light was out. I could hear something moving around below. Not scurrying, not like a rat or mouse. Something heavier, dragging, scraping. It stopped when I leaned forward to try and see, and then, just as I was about to wake up, I felt something grab my ankle. I jolted out of bed, gasping, heart racing. Milo was nowhere in sight, which was unusual. He always curled up near my feet at night. I found him an hour later hiding behind the dryer, his fur matted and his eyes wide. He wouldn't come out for almost a day. A few days later, I had a plumber over to check a leak in the laundry room. While he worked, he asked if I'd recently done any work on the pipes down there. I told him no. He said, "Huh," and then disappeared into the basement. After about 10 minutes, he came back up looking a little pale. I asked what was wrong, and he hesitated before saying, "You know you've got a sealed door down there, right?" I blinked. "What door?" He pointed toward the far left wall behind the water heater. "It's been bricked over, but you can see the outline. Cement job looks old, really old, like it's been there since the house was built." I didn't like that. Not one bit. That night, I went down with a flashlight and looked for myself. Sure enough, behind some stacked boxes and old shelving, there it was. A slightly raised rectangular shape in the wall, maybe 4 feet wide, 7 feet tall. I tapped on it. Solid. But just faintly, I thought I could feel a breeze coming through a crack. I had nightmares again. Worse ones. In them, the basement stretched forever. The light would turn off by itself, and I'd hear whispering, deep, guttural, unintelligible voices echoing behind the walls. And always, at the end, that door would open. Slowly. And something would start to crawl out. Not run. Crawl. Like it wasn't used to moving. I was exhausted. The sleep deprivation hit hard, and work started to suffer. I asked a contractor friend to come check out the wall. I didn't tell him about the dreams, just said I thought it was an old storage area or cold chute someone sealed up. He started hammering at the brick one Saturday. Milo wouldn't come anywhere near the basement door while it was happening. He yowled from upstairs, pacing anxiously, tail down. After a few hours, we exposed the frame of a wooden door behind the brick. It was rotted, gray with age, and had no knob, just a rusted iron ring like something from a medieval dungeon. The wood was damp to the touch, though the basement had no moisture problems. We pried it open. The smell hit us instantly. I can't even describe it accurately. Rot, death, sewage, rust. An ancient, sour stench that stuck in my throat. We shined flashlights inside. It was a narrow tunnel, no more than 5 feet wide, dug into the dirt and reinforced with old wooden beams. It stretched back into total darkness. We didn't go inside. My friend said, "You need to seal this back up immediately. Whatever this is, it's not safe." That night, the noises changed. It wasn't a thump anymore. It was footsteps, slow, deliberate, as if someone barefoot was walking across the concrete. I sat at the top of the stairs, hand on the doorknob, listening. Then they stopped. I didn't open the door. I moved Milo into my room permanently and kept the door shut at night. He didn't complain. The next few weeks were a blur. I kept the basement sealed, but something had changed in the house. I'd find lights on when I knew I turned them off. Cold spots in the hall. The whispering started. Just soft enough that I wasn't sure if I was imagining it. Always just beyond the edge of hearing. Always coming from beneath me. I brought in a priest. I'm not even religious, but I was desperate. He walked through the house, said a few blessings. When he got to the basement, he refused to go down, said the presence there was wrong. His exact words were, "It's not a ghost. It's older than that." I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I drifted off sometime after 3 a.m., only to wake to the sound of something moving in the hallway. The basement door was wide open, and I hadn't touched it in days. I shut it and nailed it shut. Nailed it shut. The next day, I found scratches, deep ones on the inside of the door. Not like someone trying to claw out, like something trying to claw its way in. I moved out 2 weeks later. I didn't sell the house, I just left. Packed what I needed, took Milo, and started renting a 1-bedroom in the city. I never went back, never checked the cameras I installed, never followed up with the city records about what that basement was, but I still dream of it. The whispering, the dragging, the slow, deliberate crawl. And sometimes in the middle of the night, Milo will sit up on the bed, ears twitching, and stare at the door like he hears something coming up the stairs. Story the end. We moved into the house in late September. My wife Melinda and I had been searching for a place that offered both space and affordability. Hard to find in our area unless you were willing to compromise. The house was a foreclosure, sat empty for nearly 2 years, and was priced far below anything else we'd seen. On paper, it was a dream come true. 3 bedrooms, a backyard, and a finished basement. But the moment I stepped through the front door during our initial walkthrough, I had a strange sensation. Not fear, not dread, just a faint, dull pressure in the air, like being underwater. Melinda didn't seem to notice anything. She loved it instantly. I kept my reservations to myself and rationalized that I was just tired. We were moving out of a cramped apartment and into our first home. Stress was natural. We bought the house 2 weeks later. The first few days were uneventful. We unpacked boxes, painted the bedrooms, and started making the place feel like ours. The basement, fully finished and carpeted, became our storage room for the time being. It was cooler than the rest of the house, which made sense, but it always felt just a bit too cold, like the kind of chill you'd feel in a walk-in freezer, especially if you stood still for too long. I didn't go down there much. The lights worked fine, and there were no signs of mold or moisture, but I couldn't shake the unease I felt every time I descended those stairs. The walls were painted a deep, muddy gray, and there was a small, sealed door under the main stairwell. It looked like it had once been used as a coal chute or some kind of access panel, but now it was bolted shut from the outside. Melinda joked that it probably led to Narnia. I didn't find it funny. A couple of weeks after we settled in, Melinda started saying she could hear noises from the basement when she was alone upstairs. Nothing loud, more like shuffling or soft dragging sounds. She thought maybe mice had gotten in, and I agreed to check it out. I went down with a flashlight one evening and stood still, waiting. There was nothing. But as I was about to go back upstairs, I felt a soft vibration through the floor. It was subtle, almost like someone was knocking lightly on the underside of the basement carpet. I stood frozen for a few seconds, then convinced myself it was the house settling or maybe the HVAC system. Still, the unease returned, stronger now. I left the basement lights on that night. The following weekend, Melinda was out with her sister, and I was home alone. Around 10 p.m., I heard the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open. I paused the TV and listened. Nothing. I checked the front door, still locked, same with the back, but when I passed by the basement stairs, the door was open. I was sure I had closed it. I stood at the top of the stairs, looking down. The basement light was off, but I could see just far enough to know the door to the storage room, normally closed, was wide open. Something was wrong. I stepped back and shut the door. I didn't lock it. I should have, but I just walked away. That night I couldn't sleep. Around 3 a.m., I woke up needing to pee, and as I walked past the stairwell to the bathroom, I heard it again. The dragging. It was faint, rhythmic, like something heavy being pulled across the floor in slow intervals. I stood still, my ears straining to catch every detail, and then it stopped. I never made it to the bathroom. I just turned around and went back to bed, pulling the covers over my head like a child. The next day I told Melinda. She laughed at first, but then saw the look on my face and stopped. "Let's get someone to check it out," she said. "Maybe there's a raccoon or something." We had a pest control company come by. The guy checked everything: attic, basement, vents, crawl space. No signs of animals, no droppings, no damage, no holes. "It's tight," he said. "No way anything's getting in or out." A few days later, Melinda started talking in her sleep. It was low and mumbled, but persistent. I'd wake up to her whispering things like, "No, not now," or "Please don't," followed by her breathing accelerating as if she were running. One night, she screamed loud enough to make me jump out of bed. When I woke her, she looked pale and disoriented. "I dreamt someone was crawling up the stairs," she said. "I could hear their fingernails dragging across the steps." I didn't tell her, but I had heard the same thing 2 nights before. It got worse after that. The lights in the basement began to flicker whenever we went down there. I changed the bulbs and checked the fuse box. Nothing helped. I tried to convince myself it was faulty wiring, even though the rest of the house was fine. One night, we decided to move some of the boxes from the basement into the attic. Melinda stayed upstairs while I went down to get them. As I was sorting through a stack of books, I heard a loud thud behind me. I turned quickly. Nothing there. Then another thud, this time directly above me, like something heavy hitting the floor. I sprinted upstairs and found Melinda in the kitchen. She hadn't heard anything. But later that night, while we were in bed, we both heard the sound again. A deep thudding noise, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from below the floorboards, like footsteps, but slower, heavier. Melinda grabbed my arm. "That's not a raccoon," I nodded. We both sat there in silence until the sound stopped. We called a contractor the next morning. I told him I wanted to know what was behind the sealed door in the basement. He brought over tools and a crowbar, and I stood by as he removed the bolts. It took him a few minutes, but eventually the panel popped free, revealing a small, dark cavity behind the wall. He shone a flashlight inside. It wasn't empty. There were bones. Animal, maybe. Or at least that's what I told myself. And dolls. At least 3 of them. Old porcelain-faced ones, dirty and cracked, one with its eyes missing. They were sitting upright in a neat little row. The far wall had scratches on it, like something, or someone, had tried to claw their way out. The contractor backed away slowly. "You need to call someone," he said. This isn't right." We called the police. They took the bones in for analysis, but we never got a follow-up. Weeks passed. The calls I made went unanswered. Eventually, I gave up asking. But things in the house changed. Melinda grew distant. She stopped sleeping in our bed and started taking naps in the guest room. She said she felt watched in our bedroom. I tried staying in there with her once, but the feeling was overwhelming. It felt like someone was standing in the corner of the room, just staring. She refused to go near the basement after that day. I couldn't blame her. Then came the scratching. At first, it was only at night and only faint. It would start low on the walls and move upward slowly. Sometimes it would stop right outside our door. One time it didn't stop. It just kept scratching all night. I recorded it on my phone. When I played it back the next day, there was nothing, just silence. That was when I realized it was never recorded. Whatever it was, it didn't want to be documented. It wanted to be experienced. Personally, I started having dreams of a woman. Pale skin, dark sunken eyes, wearing a torn dress. She never spoke, just stood at the foot of our bed, watching. Sometimes she would raise her hand and point to the basement door. When I refused to go, her mouth would open in a silent scream, wide and stretched unnaturally until her jaw unhinged. I'd wake up sweating every time. One night, I woke to find Melinda standing in the hallway, facing the basement door. Her hands were at her sides, and her head was tilted slightly. I called her name, but she didn't respond. I walked up and gently touched her shoulder. She flinched and turned to me, confused. I thought I heard someone calling me, she said. I didn't let her finish. I pulled her back to bed. 2 days later, she was gone. She left me a note, said she couldn't take it anymore, said the house wanted her, said it whispered to her at night, told her secrets about the ground, about what was buried there. The note ended with, "Please don't try to find me. I'm not safe. Neither are you." I haven't heard from her since. I tried to leave too. Packed up everything into a U-Haul and drove away. I made it as far as the next town before the engine died. Completely dead. No lights, no radio, nothing. I slept in the cab and had it towed back in the morning. When I got home, the basement door was open again, and all the boxes I'd packed were back where they were, like I had never touched them. I can't leave. I've tried. It won't let me. My phone doesn't work half the time. My emails bounce, and I swear to God, I see her, Melinda, standing at the top of the basement stairs sometimes. Her head tilted just like that night. She doesn't move, just watches. I sleep with all the lights on now. I haven't gone into the basement in weeks, but I hear it. Every night. Scratching, dragging, knocking, and whispering. It whispers my name now. Story the end. I grew up in southern Illinois, in a town so small it didn't even have its own gas station until I was a teenager. Our house sat just outside the limits, one of those older colonial-style homes you'd find on winding country roads. It was my grandparents' place originally, passed down to my father when they passed. That house was big, but it never felt cozy. My earliest memories there include cold winters, drafty hallways, and a basement that seemed to breathe on its own. The basement was always a sore spot. My dad used it to store old tools, spare furniture, and decades' worth of family belongings that no one ever sorted. It wasn't a finished basement, just concrete floors, exposed pipes, and a set of rickety wooden stairs that creaked every time you stepped on them. We didn't go down there unless we absolutely had to, and even then we tried to be quick. When I was 16, my mom got a job offer 2 towns over and started commuting every day. It left me and my dad alone most evenings, and while we weren't particularly close, we got by. One night, he asked me to help him reorganize the basement. He said something about the breaker box being too hard to get to, blocked by old furniture. I didn't argue. It was a Saturday, and I didn't have any real plans. We headed down with a couple of flashlights and a small lamp he plugged into the wall at the top of the stairs. The basement had a single overhead bulb, but it was so dim it made the shadows even worse. The concrete floor was damp in places, not from a leak, just condensation from the cooling air. There was always a kind of earthy, sour smell down there, like wet soil and moldy cardboard. As we began shifting old cabinets and boxes, I kept getting this strange feeling like someone was watching us. I know how that sounds, but it wasn't just paranoia. Every time I looked toward the far corner of the basement, where the floor sloped down slightly and disappeared into darker shadows, I felt like I was interrupting something. I tried to ignore it. My dad didn't seem to notice, or at least he didn't say anything. We spent a couple of hours clearing the area around the breaker, then we called it a night. As we climbed the stairs, I noticed something odd. The basement door, which we had left open, was closed. I even remembered placing a shoe to wedge it, but the shoe was still on the floor, just not in the door frame anymore. My dad said maybe we bumped it during the moving, but I was certain we hadn't. That night, as I tried to fall asleep, I kept hearing faint sounds, like movement beneath the floorboards. Our bedrooms were on the second floor, but the sound was unmistakable. Something shuffling, dragging, maybe even whispering. I chalked it up to the house settling or maybe mice. Still, I had trouble sleeping. Over the next few days, small things started to happen. We'd hear the basement door creak open on its own, even when it was latched. Tools would be moved. My dad accused me of going down there without telling him, but I hadn't. I didn't want to. One afternoon, I came home from school to find the front door wide open. My dad's truck was in the driveway, but the house was dead silent. I walked through, calling out. When I reached the kitchen, I heard thudding coming from the basement. Not loud, just methodical, like someone tapping wood against stone. I shouted for him again, thinking he was downstairs working on something. I walked over and opened the basement door. The light was off. I hesitated, then clicked on the switch. Nothing. I called down again. No answer. Something about the silence made me uneasy, like the air was heavier. I took a step down, then another, until I was halfway. That's when I heard it. It wasn't my dad. It was a voice, low and guttural, muttering words I couldn't understand. And then something else. A laugh, dry and breathy, right beneath me. I didn't wait. I turned and ran back up, slamming the door behind me. I stayed in the kitchen, watching the doorknob, until my dad came in from the backyard 10 minutes later. He said he'd been fixing a leak in the shed and hadn't been inside all day. That night, I insisted we check the basement together. He agreed, though he was clearly annoyed. We took 2 flashlights and went down slowly. The moment we stepped off the last stair, we were hit with the worst stench I've ever smelled. It was like something had died and rotted for weeks. My dad coughed and gagged, accusing some animal of getting in. But there was nothing. We searched the whole place. No carcasses, no trash, nothing unusual, except for one thing. One of the support beams in the corner had been scratched, deeply. Claw marks, not from a raccoon or squirrel. These were deep gouges in the wood, spaced too widely to be from a small animal. We both stood staring at it, unsure of what to say. My dad finally muttered that we'd have someone come check for pests, but he didn't sound convinced. Over the next few weeks, things escalated. I started having dreams, terrible ones, always in the basement. I'd see myself standing in the corner, surrounded by shadows. Something would crawl out of the wall, long arms, skin like burnt leather, no eyes, just a mouthful of teeth, and whisper my name. Every time I'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, the same phrase repeating in my head, "Don't go down." One morning, my dad didn't come up for breakfast. I knocked on his door, no answer. I opened it. He wasn't there. The bed looked untouched. His phone was still on the nightstand. I checked the rest of the house, panic growing. Then I noticed it. The basement door was ajar. Not wide open, just cracked an inch. I called his name again and again. No answer. I stood at the door, staring into the darkness. My hands were shaking. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to call someone. But I went down. The air was freezing, far colder than usual. Each step echoed like I was in a cavern. I reached the bottom and swung my flashlight around and saw nothing. No sign of my dad, no sound, just the faint dripping from one of the pipes. I walked toward the far corner and calling his name softly. That's when the light flickered. It wasn't from my flashlight, it was the overhead bulb. It sputtered, buzzed, then went out entirely. I was left in complete darkness. My flashlight cut through it just enough to see the floor, the walls, the support beams, and then I saw him. My dad, kneeling in the corner, facing the wall, unmoving. I ran to him, calling out, grabbing his shoulder. His skin was ice cold. He didn't respond. I turned him gently, and that's when I dropped the flashlight. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly. His mouth was hanging open, as if frozen in the middle of a scream. But he wasn't dead. He blinked, slowly. His lips trembled like he wanted to speak, but no sound came out. Then he looked past me, over my shoulder, and his entire body tensed. I turned, expecting to see something, anything, but there was nothing, just shadow. Then the smell hit again, sour, moldy, like rotting flesh and wet dirt. I dragged my dad upstairs by the arm. It was difficult. He wasn't moving, just shuffling along stiffly. I slammed the door shut and locked it. Then I called 911. At the hospital, the doctors said he was catatonic. No trauma, no stroke, just blank, like his brain had turned off. He stayed like that for weeks. I didn't go back to the house. I stayed with my mom in a small apartment near her work. She didn't ask many questions, just that I seemed different, scared. I never told her the full story. A month later, I returned with 2 officers and a specialist in structural inspections. I told them I thought something might be wrong with the foundation, maybe gas, anything to get someone else to go into that basement. The inspector went down first. After 20 minutes, he came back up, pale and visibly shaken. He said he wouldn't go down there again, not for any amount of money. He refused to elaborate. The officers didn't find anything unusual, no bodies, no evidence of a break-in. But I noticed one thing they missed. In the far corner of the basement, on the wall behind the support beam, there was something carved into the concrete. A symbol. I didn't recognize it, just a circle with jagged lines and what looked like an eye in the center. That part was new. I had never seen it before, and the scratches around it were deeper. I had the house sealed off. My mother sold it without telling the buyers anything. I don't think she knew. My dad never recovered. He lives in a long-term care facility now. Sometimes I visit. He still doesn't talk, but he reacts to certain things. Whenever I mention the house, his eyes well up and he shakes his head slowly, over and over. Last week, I went through one of his old toolboxes that I had brought to my apartment. Inside, buried under screwdrivers and nails, was a Polaroid I don't remember seeing before. It was of the basement, taken years ago, probably before I was born. You could see the far corner clearly. And in the shadow, barely visible, was a figure, tall, thin, bent awkwardly, with arms that nearly reached the floor. Its head was tilted, and there were no eyes, just that wide, tooth-filled mouth. Story the end. When I moved into the duplex, I wasn't looking for anything fancy, just something cheap, close to work, and with enough room to keep me from feeling boxed in. It was an old brick building split into 2 mirror image units, with a shared basement accessible from separate doors inside each unit. The landlord, a soft-spoken man named Greg, told me the basement had storage areas partitioned off with plywood and chicken wire. I remember him mentioning it might feel a little creepy because the light was dim and the concrete smelled damp, but he reassured me it was safe and secure. At first, I barely thought about the basement. I kept a few boxes down there, old books, some tools, winter clothes, just enough to warrant locking my side of the storage. The rest of the time, I ignored it. That changed around the 3rd week. It was late October, and I was still adjusting to the new place. I'd waking up at odd hours from the unfamiliar creaks and groans the house made at night. The first time it happened, it was 2:17 a.m. I woke up to the sound of something knocking. Not pounding, but distinct, spaced-out thuds, like someone tapping a knuckle against hollow wood. It took me a few seconds to register it wasn't in my dream. I sat up, disoriented, and listened. The knocks came again. 3 short raps, a pause, then 3 more. I froze. They were coming from below me, through the floor, near where the kitchen met the hallway. I got out of bed and walked barefoot across the cold floor. I stood still for almost a minute, listening. Nothing. I chalked it up to the building settling or a neighbor coming home late. But then it happened again the next night. This time, the knocking was followed by a creaking sound, wood shifting under pressure. It reminded me of someone slowly pushing a heavy door open. When I went downstairs in the morning, everything looked untouched. I unlocked the basement door and peeked down into the dark. The light at the bottom of the stairs flickered once, then steadied. The air was thick with that musty, cold smell only basements seem to hold on to. I went down, holding the railing tightly. My storage area was locked, and the other one, belonging to the other tenant, a woman I hadn't met yet, was too. I stood there for a minute, trying to imagine what could have caused the noises, but nothing stood out. Just concrete, exposed pipes, and the faint hum of the water heater. I didn't tell anyone right away. It felt silly. But the knocking became a pattern, always between 2 and 3 a.m., always from the same spot. Eventually, I asked the neighbor on the other side, a quiet woman named Sandra. She looked at me for a long second and said, "You've been hearing it too, huh?" She didn't elaborate much, just said she'd been there 2 years and that the sounds came and went. Sometimes they'd stop for months. Other times they came every night for a week straight. "I stopped asking questions," she said. "As long as nothing's broken into, I just ignore it." I tried to do the same. I even wore earplugs to bed, but that just made me feel more vulnerable, like I was deliberately silencing myself to the house. Then one night I didn't hear knocking. I heard breathing. Slow, labored, wet breathing. I was wide awake, scrolling on my phone when it started. It wasn't in my head. I could hear it, like it was coming from a vent or a crawl space. It would wheeze in, then pause, then exhale with a rasp. I turned off the fan to be sure it wasn't some mechanical sound. It continued for nearly 5 minutes. I didn't sleep at all that night. In the morning, I opened the basement door again and stood there, staring into the dark. I didn't go down, not that time. I just stood there, hand on the doorknob, feeling like something was standing down there waiting for me. That weekend, I bought a cheap security camera and aimed it down the stairs. I didn't tell anyone about it. I just wanted peace of mind, to catch a raccoon or a broken pipe or something that made sense. The next few nights were uneventful. But then on Wednesday, I checked the footage. The camera had motion alerts. There was one pinged at 2:39 a.m. I opened the clip. The basement was quiet, dim, nothing moving. Then something flickered past the frame. Quick, too fast to make out. I rewound and paused it frame by frame. It was blurry, but the best way I can describe it is like a shape. Humanoid, but hunched and wrong, like it had too many joints or none at all. It moved in a jerky, unnatural way, like it was dragging itself but fast. I watched the rest of the clip with the volume up. Right before the motion alert ended, I heard it. Breathing. The same wet, labored breathing. But this time it was louder, and it stopped suddenly. Not faded out, just stopped like someone cut a wire. I almost threw up. I emailed the landlord. I didn't show him the video, just asked if anyone had access to the basement other than us. He said no. I asked if there were any crawl spaces, old tunnels, or sub-basements. He said no, not as far as he knew. It's a simple foundation, poured concrete, nothing fancy. Why? I didn't answer. I couldn't explain it without sounding insane. Then things got worse. I started noticing things out of place. My kitchen cabinet would be slightly open in the morning. My shoes weren't where I left them. The bathroom door creaked open by itself at 3:12 a.m. I caught that one in real time, watched it swing open slowly as I sat on the couch, paralyzed. The worst was the smell. It started as a faint, sour odor, like rotting potatoes. But then it grew stronger, thick and cloying, like a mix of mildew, sweat, and something sharp, like bleach and copper. It came from the vents. I'd wake up gagging. I even called the gas company, but they found nothing. One night around 3 a.m., I woke up to a noise I couldn't ignore. It was loud this time. Not knocking, not breathing. Scraping. A slow, dragging scrape like metal across concrete. I got up, grabbed a flashlight, and went downstairs. I didn't turn on the light at the top. I opened the basement door and stood at the top of the stairs. Silence. Then from below, a low voice, not loud, not even words, just a sound like whispering through clenched teeth. I couldn't move. My legs locked up, and I held the flashlight so tight my knuckles cracked. Then something moved at the bottom of the stairs. A shape, too pale, too tall, leaned just into view. It didn't look up at me. It just hovered there, half in the shadows, long arms hanging slack. The breathing came again. Louder. Closer. I slammed the door shut and locked it. Then I pushed the couch in front of it. That morning, the door was wide open. The couch was still in place, untouched. I left the house that day and didn't come back until it was light out. I didn't sleep there again. I started sleeping in my car, parked a few blocks away. I didn't care. I just wanted to be away from whatever that thing was. But I had to go back one last time. My lease wasn't up for 2 more months, and I had personal papers, a laptop, and a few things I couldn't leave behind. I went back during the day, brought a friend with me, Mike. He thought I was overreacting until he walked into the kitchen and gagged at the smell. Then he heard the faint, dragging noise under the floor. We opened the basement door together. This time, the light didn't turn on. We went down with our phones as flashlights. My storage unit door was wide open, the padlock twisted off like it had been chewed. Inside, everything was torn apart, clothes shredded, books soaked in something dark. The concrete floor had scratches, deep, ragged gouges as if something had been clawing its way out of the walls. Mike stood there frozen, then said, "Dude, someone's living down here." I wanted to believe that. I did. Then we heard the breathing. From the far end of the basement, steady, wet, and rhythmic. We both turned our lights in that direction. There was a hole in the far wall. I swear to God it wasn't there before. A jagged break in the concrete, about 3 feet wide. Beyond it, only darkness. And inside the hole, just barely visible, was a face. not fully human, pale, sunken eyes. It blinked, then started moving toward us. Fast. We ran. Mike didn't even stop to shut the basement door. We just bolted out the front and didn't stop until we were 2 blocks away. I broke the lease. Greg didn't even argue. He just muttered something about this happening before and promised to have someone seal it off again. That word, again, still haunts me. I live in a third-floor apartment now. No basement, no shared walls, but sometimes when I wake up in the middle of the night, I still hear the breathing. Story. The end. It was never supposed to be anything more than a temporary arrangement. When my cousin Brian asked if I could house it for a month while he and his wife took their long overdue vacation to Europe, I didn't hesitate. They lived about an hour away in a quiet, older neighborhood just outside of Harrisburg. The house itself was a 2-story colonial with creaky floors, antique furniture, and a basement that Brian insisted I never needed to go into. He wasn't secretive about it, just dismissive. Old storage junk, moisture issues. We keep it locked, so just ignore it. I didn't care. I had access to a full kitchen, 2 guest bedrooms, and their massive TV setup. In exchange, I just needed to check the mail, water some plants, and feed their cat Waffles. Brian gave me the code to the front door, the Wi-Fi password, and left me with a stocked fridge. It seemed like a peaceful getaway from my small apartment and noisy neighbors. The first few nights were uneventful. Waffles followed me around like a dog, yowling at closed doors and rubbing her face against my legs. She kept staring at the basement door, meowing and pawing at the base as if something were underneath it. The door was at the end of a short hallway that split the kitchen from the living room. I shrugged it off, assuming maybe she had a mouse or bug trail she was obsessed with. But things began to get strange. One night, around 2 a.m., I was woken by a loud thud. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and waited. Another sound, like wood creaking, echoed from somewhere below. I got up, walked to the hallway, and listened. Nothing. I checked Waffles. She wasn't on the bed like usual. I found her sitting stiffly in front of the basement door, tail puffed out, ears pinned back. Her body trembled with quiet growls. I scooped her up, brought her back to bed, and tried to sleep with the blankets pulled up to my neck. The next morning, I convinced myself it was just the old house settling. I hadn't grown up around houses like Brian's. Mine was a modern build with tight insulation and no character. But this one groaned and shifted like it had bones that ached. Still, I couldn't ignore how Waffles kept watching that basement door. Every day, she'd sit there for hours, only leaving when I picked her up. And then there was the smell. It started faintly, like wet soil or mold, but by the 4th night it turned rancid, pungent and sour like rotting meat. It didn't seem to come from anywhere specific, but always lingered around the basement door. I lit candles, sprayed air freshener, even cleaned the kitchen drains, thinking maybe something had backed up. But nothing worked. The stench would come and go, thick as fog, then vanish as quickly as it appeared. The turning point was the 5th night. I was watching a movie in the living room when the doorbell rang. I paused the TV and chimed, 11:43 p.m. I hesitated before walking to the door. Nobody should have been visiting. When I looked through the peephole, nobody was there. Thinking maybe it was a prank, I turned off the porch light and went back to the couch. Then the doorbell rang again. This time, I jumped. I got up quicker now and looked out the peephole. Still no one. But Waffles was growling now, deep and low, pacing toward the basement. I turned toward her, and the moment I did, I heard the unmistakable click of the basement door unlocking. I froze. That door had been locked since I got there. Brian never gave me a key. It didn't have a doorknob, just one of those old iron handles with a bolt latch. Waffles bolted under the couch. The silence afterward was almost painful. My ears rang with adrenaline, and the only sound I could hear was my own shallow breathing. I tiptoed toward the basement door, hands shaking, and gently pressed my ear to it. Nothing. I waited for what felt like 5 full minutes before backing away and grabbing my phone. I called Brian. No answer. I texted him, something vague like, "Hey, is there any chance that door ever unlocks by itself?" And left it at that. That night I slept with my bedroom door locked and a flashlight under the covers. The next morning I checked the basement door. Still shut, latch in place. But something had changed. There were scratch marks on the door. Not small ones either, long, deep gouges that ran across the surface in erratic vertical patterns. They were too wide to be from Waffles and too high up. I touched one. The wood splintered easily at the edges like it was freshly carved. I started thinking maybe someone had broken in through the basement. Maybe a vagrant, or someone who knew Brian was away. But there were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, nothing missing from upstairs. If someone was down there, they hadn't come up. I wanted to call the police, but what would I say? Hey, my cousin told me not to go into the basement, but now it smells weird and my cat hates it? They'd laugh me off. So instead, I went to Home Depot and bought a heavy-duty latch and a padlock. I drilled them into the door and doubled up on the security. Whatever was going on down there, I didn't want it coming up. That night, around 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of the padlock rattling. I lay in bed, paralyzed, listening as the metal clinked and jangled. Waffles hissed beside me, her claws digging into my arm. It stopped after maybe a minute, but I didn't sleep after that. I sat up with the lights on, heart hammering, phone in hand. Brian finally texted back around noon the next day. That door better be locked. Don't go down there. No matter what you hear, just wait till we're back. That was all he said. I stared at that message for a long time, wondering what he knew that I didn't. Why keep something in the basement that needed locking up? That afternoon, I went outside and walked around to the side of the house. There were 2 tiny barred windows low to the ground that looked into the basement. I crouched down and tried to peer in through the dirty glass. At first, I couldn't see anything. Then my eyes adjusted to the dark. It was a wide room with unfinished concrete walls and what looked like piles of old furniture and boxes. But in the center, lit by a single hanging bulb, was a chair. A wooden chair. It faced the far wall, and though I could only make out shadows, I swear I saw someone sitting in it. They didn't move, but something about the shape, slouched, arms stiff, head bowed, made my stomach knot. I backed away from the window and left the side yard without looking back. That evening I couldn't eat. I paced the house, lights on in every room, jumping at every noise. The smell came back, stronger than ever. Waffles hid in the bathroom cabinet and refused to come out. Then the whispering started. It began low, almost like static from a distant radio. I thought I was imagining it. But as I stood in the hallway outside the kitchen, I could hear it, coming from behind the basement door. It didn't sound like English. The syllables were rough, strained, broken up by heavy breathing. Then there was a thump, and another, like footsteps on concrete. I ran upstairs and shut myself in the bedroom, pressing my back to the door. The whispering faded but didn't stop completely. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the chair. I saw the shape in it. At dawn, I got a message from Brian. We're flying home early. Don't answer the door. Don't talk to it, and don't open the basement. That was it. No explanation. That night, everything escalated. Around 2 a.m., the smoke detectors all went off, blasting from every room, shrieking at full volume. I ran downstairs, flipping light switches, panicked. There was no smoke, no fire. I checked the oven, the outlets, everything. Nothing. Then they stopped. Just like that. Silence. Except not silence. From behind the basement door came this sound, low moaning, like someone in pain. Waffles began to screech, clawing at the walls in the hallway, trying to escape. The moaning turned into something else. Laughter. Dry, breathless laughter that chilled my blood. I ran to the front door, but when I tried to open it, it wouldn't budge. The lock turned, the bolt slid free, but it felt like something on the other side was holding it shut. And then I heard the knock. 3 slow knocks on the other side of the door. I looked through the peephole. It was me, or something that looked like me. Same face, same clothes, but the eyes were wrong. Too wide, too dark. It smiled when I looked through and then raised its hand and waved slowly. I fell backward from the door and scrambled to the kitchen, heart pounding. When I dared peek again, it was gone. The next morning, Brian and his wife arrived. They looked exhausted, like they hadn't slept the entire flight. I barely let them get inside before I was shoving the keys at them. Brian pulled me aside while his wife checked the house. He looked me in the eye and asked, "Did anything open the door?" I shook my head. "No, but it tried." He nodded slowly. "Good. You did better than the last guy." I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't want to know. I packed my bags and left within the hour. I don't talk to Brian much anymore. We still exchange texts now and then, but I never went back to that house. He eventually moved, said the foundation had issues and the smell kept getting worse. I asked him once, just once, what was really in the basement. All he said was, something my grandfather locked in and something I never should have inherited. Story the end. When I was 19, I moved into a split-level rental house just outside of Dayton, Ohio, with two other guys I met through a mutual friend. The house was cheap, almost suspiciously so, but we were all broke and desperate to move out of our respective parents' homes. It was one of those beige homes with dark red shutters, built sometime in the late 60s, set in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood that didn't seem to have many people under the age of 50. The basement was partially finished and advertised as great for storage, but the landlord was quick to discourage us from using it as a bedroom. The first time I walked down into the basement, I got this weird tightness in my chest. Not fear, exactly. Just an off feeling, like I'd walked into a room someone had been screaming in only minutes before. It smelled musty and dry, like an old cellar. The walls were a strange, yellowish white, stained and cracked in spots. Half of the floor was cement, the other half covered in thin carpeting that felt like it had been there for decades. A rusty drain sat dead center in the unfinished area. I didn't want to stay long down there, and neither did the other guys, Greg and Marcus, so we left it mostly untouched, only going down to put boxes away or do laundry. The strange stuff started small. Every now and then we'd hear this muffled sound at night, like thudding or dragging. At first we thought it might be the hot water pipes knocking, or maybe just the old house settling. It was an old structure after all. But then came the smell. One morning, Marcus came upstairs with this look on his face. Pale, a little sweaty. He said something was wrong with the basement. I followed him down and immediately noticed it. The air was thick and metallic, like pennies soaked in vinegar. It was strong, almost gagging. We checked the drain, thinking maybe something backed up, but it was dry. There were no dead animals or trash, and the pipes weren't leaking. We opened the basement windows and left the fans running, and by the next morning the smell was gone. We forgot about it. A few weeks passed. Then one night, around 2 a.m., I was up late watching a movie in the living room when I heard footsteps. Slow, creaking footsteps, too heavy to be the old pipes. It sounded like someone was walking upstairs. I muted the TV and sat still. The other guys were supposed to be asleep. I called out quietly, "Greg?" No answer. I waited a moment. The footsteps continued, deliberate, slow. I grabbed the baseball bat we kept near the front door and went upstairs. Both bedroom doors were shut, lights off. I knocked on Greg's door. He answered, groggy. "What? Did you just walk around?" "No, I've been out cold, man." I checked Marcus's room. Same thing. He was in bed, half asleep, annoyed I woke him up. But I knew what I'd heard. The next morning I told them about the footsteps. Greg was skeptical. Marcus, though, looked at me with this expression like he'd heard something too, but hadn't wanted to admit it. That day, we went down to the basement together. There was something almost daring about it, like we had to prove to ourselves it was just a normal part of the house. We turned on all the lights. Everything looked the same. No signs of intruders, but the far end of the carpeted section was darker than usual, like the light didn't quite reach that corner, even though the bulbs were on. Marcus pointed out a circular stain near the drain. It looked recent, reddish-brown, about the size of a basketball. We stared at it, trying to come up with explanations. Maybe rust? Dirt? It didn't smell, but none of us wanted to get too close. Greg joked nervously that someone must have sacrificed a goat down there. That night, Marcus had a dream. He told us the next morning, looking shaken. Said he dreamt of being in the basement, only it wasn't our basement anymore. The walls were red, the light was flickering, and there was someone standing in the corner. Tall, with no face, just a silhouette that breathed loud, guttural breaths. Marcus said he tried to move but couldn't, and the closer he got to waking, the louder the breathing became. Then, just as he woke up, he swore he heard it whisper his name. He was dead serious. I could tell he wasn't making it up. Greg laughed it off, but that same night I had my own version of the dream. Only mine started upstairs. I was walking toward the basement door, but it wasn't locked like it usually was. It was wide open. Inside, there was only blackness. I stepped down once, then again, and suddenly I was at the bottom without remembering how I got there. Everything was gray, like the color had been drained from the room. And there was something in the drain. Not a person or animal, just a shape. Small, moving like it was twitching or alive. I woke up sweating. I didn't tell the guys. I figured I was just spooked by Marcus's story. Things escalated quickly after that. The noises got louder. Not just footsteps, but voices. You could never make out the words, but they were there. Muttering, whispering, sometimes screaming, only for a few seconds. Greg finally admitted he heard something too, when he was doing laundry. He said he heard a woman crying. Not wailing, just soft, broken sobs echoing from the corner near the water heater. When he turned around, no one was there. He bolted up the stairs and didn't go down there again for a week. Then came the flies. One morning, I opened the basement door to throw a bag of clothes into the wash, and a swarm of black flies shot past my face. Dozens of them. I slammed the door shut, heart pounding. We opened the windows again, sprayed insect killer, set traps, everything, but no matter what, they came back. Always in the basement, never in the rest of the house. We called the landlord. He came out and looked around, but shrugged it off. It's just an old house. Bugs get in. Probably something died in the walls. He didn't seem surprised. In fact, now that I think about it, he looked more uncomfortable than dismissive. Greg finally confronted him before he left and asked if anything had ever happened in the house. The landlord paused. Then he said, "Not while I've owned it," and left. That night, I woke up to Marcus screaming. I ran into his room and found him standing in the corner, staring at the open door to the hallway, sweating like he'd run a marathon. He kept saying, "He was in the room. He was in the room." He didn't go back to sleep. He started crashing at his girlfriend's place most nights after that. 2 days later, Greg went to the basement alone to switch the laundry and came back up looking gray. He didn't speak at first, just walked into the living room, sat down, and stared at the floor. When I asked what happened, he said there was someone at the bottom of the stairs. He thought it was me at first, same height, build. But when he called out, the figure didn't move. It just stood there. Then it slowly turned, and Greg said its face was wrong. Not disfigured, just not human, almost like it was stretched. He ran. We made a pact not to go back down. We started hearing scratching behind the basement door at night, like nails on wood, always around 3 a.m., every night for a week. One night, I leaned against the door and listened. On the other side, I swear I heard breathing. Not animal breathing, something steady, rhythmic, deep. Then the doorknob turned. I jumped back and yelled for Marcus and Greg. We all stood there, watching the knob twitch slightly, then stop. We locked it, moved a chair in front of it. Nobody slept that night. The next day, Marcus told us he was done. Said he felt watched constantly and couldn't focus, couldn't think. He left that afternoon. A week later, Greg followed. I stayed only because I had nowhere else to go. For about 3 more weeks, I lived in that house alone. The scratching stopped. The smell came back, stronger than ever. And then one night, around 3:30 a.m., I heard it again, the basement door slowly creaking open. I had locked it. I know I had. I got up, grabbed the bat, and crept out of my room. The hallway was dark. The door was wide open, and the air pouring out of the basement was cold, colder than the rest of the house, like it was refrigerated. I leaned over the stairwell and looked down. Someone was standing at the bottom. Only this time, it was clear, tall, emaciated, skin tight to the bones, with long, black arms that almost dragged across the ground. Its head was tilted like it didn't understand what it was looking at. Then it started walking up the stairs, slowly, one step at a time. I didn't wait. I ran to my room, locked the door, and sat in the closet with my phone, shaking. I wanted to call someone, anyone, but who do you call when there's something in your basement that shouldn't exist? By morning, the basement door was shut again. I moved out that week. We never figured out what it was. I looked up property records, crime reports, everything. Nothing came up. The landlord eventually stopped responding to my calls. The last time I drove by that house, someone else was living there. I wanted to stop, warn them, tell them not to go into the basement. But I didn't. Because I know they won't listen. Nobody ever does. Until it's too late. Story the end. When I was 23, I rented the bottom half of a duplex just outside of Pittsburgh. I had just broken up with my girlfriend of 3 years, and I needed something cheap and away from everyone I knew. The place wasn't much. The upstairs tenants were an older couple who mostly kept to themselves, and the downstairs unit, mine, had this dark, cold, unfinished basement that was accessible through a narrow door next to the kitchen. The landlord said I could use the basement for storage if I wanted, but warned me that it had issues with moisture and occasional flooding. That was fine by me. I didn't have much stuff anyway. I barely stepped foot down there after moving in, maybe once to check the fuse box, and even then, I hated every second of it. Something about the way the air shifted as I stepped down those creaky wooden stairs made my skin crawl. The first few weeks passed without much incident. The apartment had its quirks, thin walls, weird plumbing sounds, but nothing unexpected. Then, about a month in, I started noticing strange seeping through the floorboards in the middle of the night. It was always strongest around 2 or 3 a.m., something thick and rotten like a mixture of mold and decay. I checked the fridge, the trash, even under the sink, thinking maybe something had gone bad. But everything was clean. Eventually, I figured it was just the basement. Moisture, mildew, maybe some dead rats or whatever. I bought some incense and a dehumidifier, thinking that would take care of it. One night, I was watching TV and dozing off when I heard a soft thump from below the floor. It wasn't loud, barely audible, but distinct enough to jolt me awake. I turned the volume down and listened. Another thump, then another. It didn't sound mechanical like the heater or the washer. It sounded intentional, like something being dropped or knocked over slowly and deliberately. I grabbed the flashlight and headed to the basement door. The moment I cracked it open, that sour, moldy stench rushed out, stronger than ever. I shivered and descended slowly, my bare feet uncomfortable on the freezing wood steps. The basement was pitch black, except for where my flashlight beam landed. Everything looked normal. The concrete floor was damp in spots, and cobwebs coated the corners. I checked behind the water heater, under the stairs. Nothing. I told myself it must have been a rat or raccoon or something. I was about to head back up when I noticed something strange. A faint trail of dark smudges leading from the far wall to a section of floor beneath a metal shelving unit. I crouched down and looked closer. The marks looked almost like footprints, not shoes or paws. Bare feet. Human, but too small to be mine. I reached for the shelving unit and pulled it aside. The cement underneath was cracked, and in the middle of the cracks, a hole about the size of a fist had opened up. It was just deep enough to see into, and I swear I could feel a current of cold air coming out of it. I backed away quickly, heart thudding, and told myself not to overthink it. Maybe the concrete was settling. Maybe there was a pipe beneath it causing erosion. That made sense. But the footprints bothered me. I avoided the basement after that. I kept the door shut and tried to ignore the sounds and smells. But they kept getting worse. Some nights I heard what sounded like whispering. Not loud, not distinct, just the sensation that someone was murmuring just below me, where there should have been no one. The smell turned unbearable around the 3rd week of October. It got so bad that even upstairs I could taste it in my mouth, like copper and rot. I called the landlord, but he brushed it off, said the basement always had issues around fall because of the rain. The breaking point came on Halloween night. I hadn't planned anything, no parties, no visitors. I was home watching a horror movie, half distracted, when all the power in the apartment cut out, total blackout, not even a flicker. I grabbed my flashlight and phone, expecting to see a text from the power company, but there was no alert. I stepped outside to see if the neighbors had lost power, but their windows glowed softly like everything was fine. Just my unit. The fuse box was, of course, in the basement. I stood at the top of the basement steps for a long time, flashlight trembling in my hand, heart pounding in my ears. Finally, I forced myself to go down. Each step creaked louder than I remembered. The deeper I went, the thicker the air became. It felt wet and heavy, almost like walking through a dense fog. When I reached the bottom, I saw that the smudge trail from earlier had deepened. It was darker now, fresher looking, like something had been dragged across the concrete. The footprints were clearer too, still barefoot, still small, still human. I swung the flashlight toward the fuse box and froze. Something was standing in the far corner of the basement. It was faint, just the silhouette of a figure, completely still, facing me. The beam of the flashlight trembled as I raised it slowly. It illuminated a young girl, no older than 6 or 7. Her hair was matted and hung over her face. Her nightgown was soaked and clung to her bony frame. Her feet were bare, and her skin looked gray, like she'd been underground for a long time. She didn't move, didn't blink. I couldn't breathe. Then she took a step forward. I turned and bolted up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind me and throwing every lock I could. I pressed my back to it, shaking, heart hammering in my chest. That night, I slept in my car. The next morning, I went back inside and checked the basement door. Still locked. I slowly opened it and looked down. Empty. I went down, slowly, step by step. The basement looked exactly the same, except the crack in the cement floor was wider now, about the size of a small hole, like it had been pried open. I called the police. They sent out 2 officers who did a full search. Found no signs of anyone living down there, no evidence of a break-in, nothing. They told me it was probably a squatter or a bad dream. When I insisted something was wrong with the hole in the floor, they gave it a cursory glance and said it was structural and needed to be sealed. I didn't sleep in the apartment again. I moved out that weekend, breaking my lease and forfeiting the deposit. The landlord didn't ask questions. A few weeks later, I received a call from one of the officers who had visited. He sounded different. Shaken. He said off the record they'd returned to the house after the new tenant called about the same smells and noises. The basement had flooded due to heavy rain, and when the city sent in a crew to repair the drainage and seal the cracks, they unearthed something. A small wooden coffin. Water damaged, nailed shut. Inside was the body of a young girl. No clothes, no ID, just a plastic doll clutched in her arms and a nightgown that matched the one I saw. The officer wouldn't tell me more, just said I wasn't crazy. The house was condemned not long after that. Last I heard, it still sits empty, windows boarded up, basement sealed in concrete. But sometimes I still dream of her, those eyes watching me from the dark corner of that basement, unmoving, unblinking, as if she were waiting for me to come back. Story the end. It was early October when I first moved into the duplex on Halston Street. The air had started turning crisp and leaves were piling up in messy drifts along the sidewalks. I'd just broken up with my girlfriend of 3 years and needed a place to live fast. A friend of a friend hooked me up with the place. Cheap rent, close to my job, and the upstairs neighbor seemed quiet. The kind of win I desperately needed. The unit was nothing special. Old linoleum floors, flickering bathroom light, cracked window seals. But it had charm, and more importantly, it was mine. The landlord, a short, pale man in his 60s named Mr. Green, had handed me the keys with a warning about the basement. "Don't go down there unless you have to," he said, looking me straight in the eye like he meant every word. "The light's faulty, stairs are steep, and the breaker box is the only thing worth touching. Don't go poking around." I shrugged it off. I wasn't planning on spending much time in a cold, moldy basement anyway. The first few days went by without issue. Work kept me busy, and I was usually too tired to do much heat up leftovers and fall asleep to the glow of the TV. But around the 4th night, I started noticing odd noises. Not loud, just enough to make me pause the TV and listen. At first it sounded like water pipes, hissing and popping. Then something else, faint, scraping, like something dragged across concrete. Once it was a metallic clink, like tools bumping together. I told myself it was an old building, maybe the neighbor moving around or pipes expanding with the weather. Then, around 2:30 a.m., I was woken up by a noise directly beneath my bedroom floor. A thud, followed by another, then silence. I lay there for what felt like 10 minutes, ears straining. The noise didn't come back. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I checked with Marcy, the woman who lived above me. She was in her late 40s, worked nights as a nurse, and rarely seemed home. "Nope, wasn't me," she said, sipping coffee on her porch. "I was at work all night. Don't know what you heard, but that basement's always been weird. Previous tenants used to complain too." "Complain about what?" She shrugged. "Noisy, drafty. Some said they heard voices, but you know how people get, imagination and all." I laughed it off and walked away, but the unease stuck with me. That weekend, I decided to do some laundry. There was a rusted washer and dryer down in the basement, bare bones, but functional. I opened the basement door, flicked on the light, and hesitated at the top of the stairs. The air that wafted up was cold and damp. The bulb at the bottom of the stairs flickered faintly. I took the steps slowly, holding the railing like it was the only thing keeping me anchored. The basement was bigger than I expected, stretching out under the entire house. A single string of lights dangled from the low ceiling beams, barely illuminating the room. The washer and dryer sat in the corner near the far wall, past a stack of old paint cans and wooden boards. As I walked across the floor, I noticed how uneven it was. Some sections dipped slightly, others were raised like the concrete had warped. The walls were caked with grime and mold streaks, and there was a door on the far end I hadn't noticed before. Heavy, wooden, bolted with a rusted padlock. That wasn't part of the blueprint Mr. Green had given me. I loaded my laundry and started the cycle. As the water began to fill the drum, I heard something. A knock, 3 distinct taps coming from the locked door. I froze, my hand hovering over the lid. Another knock, then silence. I backed away slowly, not taking my eyes off the door. It didn't move. Nothing emerged. I practically ran up the stairs, left the laundry spinning, and slammed the door shut behind me. I didn't sleep that night. By Monday, I had convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe it was the sound of the washer shaking the pipes. Maybe it was old wood settling. I worked late and didn't return home until after 9 p.m. As I walked past the basement door to get a drink, I noticed it was ajar. I hadn't opened it. I always made sure to pull it shut. The hairs on my arms stood up. I walked over, slowly pushed the door closed, and locked it. I didn't go down there again for 3 days. But the sounds got worse. Now they came nightly, scraping, knocking, once what sounded like someone whispering directly under the vent in my room. I kept the TV on to drown it out, but the whispers cut through. Always just low enough that I couldn't make out the words. One night, I decided to record the audio. I placed my phone by the vent, turned on a voice memo app, and let it run while I slept. I woke up at 3 a.m. to a dream of someone standing at the foot of my bed. When I turned the light on, no one was there. But my closet door was cracked open, and I always kept it shut. The next morning, I listened to the recording. For the first 4 hours, nothing. Then at 2:53 a.m., a noise, faint like a shuffling foot, then a whisper. I rewound it, turned the volume all the way up. I see you. Clear as day. A deep male voice. Calm. Controlled. I dropped the phone. My mouth went dry. I called the police. 2 officers came by that evening. I told them I thought someone might be living in the basement or sneaking in. They humored me, probably thinking I was drunk or paranoid. They searched the basement, checked the door, even jimmied the padlock off the wooden door at the far end. It opened into a small crawl space. Dirt floor, crumbling walls, and the smell of something long dead. There were old pieces of cloth on the floor, like torn bed sheets or rags, a few broken boards. Nothing else. No one's been in here for years, one of the officers said. They left. But I didn't feel safe. That night, I slept on the couch with every light in the apartment on. Around 1:30 a.m., I heard the basement door creak. I sat up, holding my breath. Then I heard slow, deliberate footsteps coming up the stairs. I stood and moved toward the kitchen, gripping the heaviest knife I had. The footsteps stopped. I waited. 10 minutes passed. Nothing. Then a soft knock on the door to the basement. 3 slow taps. I ran to my room, locked the door, and called Mr. Green. I told him everything. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "I should have sealed that crawl space years ago. I thought it was over." "What was over?" I asked. He sighed. "Back in the 70s, a tenant's brother stayed down there. Vietnam vet. Came back wrong, wouldn't come upstairs, said he liked the dark. One day he stopped answering. We found blood on the walls, but no body. Just scratches on the inside of that wooden door. Deep ones." I was silent. "I've had 3 tenants since then complain about noises," he continued. "One moved out after 2 weeks. One left in the middle of the night, never came back for their stuff. I should have warned you more." I told him I was leaving. He said he understood. That morning, I packed what I could fit into my car. When I went down to get my laundry, the washer door was open. All my clothes were gone. On the concrete floor was a single pair of socks, folded neatly. Sitting atop them was a rusted dog tag on a chain. The name was too corroded to read. I didn't take them. I left the place by noon and never looked back. A week later, I got a call from Marcy. She said a new tenant had moved in. 2 nights later, the police were back on Halston Street. No one answered the basement door. They had to break it down. No one ever told me what they found inside. Story the end. The house on Elm Street was old. older than anyone in the neighborhood cared to remember. When Mark inherited it from his late uncle, he was barely 30, just a few years out of college and hungry for a fresh start away from the city's relentless noise. The house was cheap, the kind of deal that looked perfect for renovation or flipping, but Mark had other plans. He wanted to live there. The first day he moved in, Mark noticed the basement door in the kitchen. It was a heavy wooden slab with a rusted metal latch tucked away beneath the old linoleum countertop. The previous owners had warned him about the basement. Old house, old basement, they said with a nervous laugh. Not much down there, but cobwebs and memories. Mark took the comment lightly, more amused than concerned. Basements were basements, cold, dark, maybe a little creepy, but nothing truly sinister. The basement smelled like damp earth and rust. The stairs creaked under his weight as he descended, the bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling flickering weakly. The concrete walls were stained and the floor was cracked in places. Old paint cans and broken furniture littered the corners, and a single battered workbench stood near the back wall. Mark set about cleaning, pushing dust and debris aside to make the space usable. On the third night, something shifted. Mark had been working late, the house silent except for the low hum of the heater. He went down to the basement to grab a box of tools. The moment he opened the door, a chill ran up his spine. The light bulb overhead was off, though he was certain he'd left it on earlier that day. He flipped the switch, nothing. He tried the bulb, it was dead. Frowning, he pulled out his phone and switched on the flashlight. As the beam swept the room, Mark froze. There, scrawled on the wall near the stairs in what looked like dried dark red paint, or was it something else, were words, "Don't look." His breath caught. He stepped back, heart pounding. The words weren't there before. He'd been down here twice that day already. He ran upstairs and checked the front door. It was locked, windows secured. No sign anyone had been in. But the message was undeniable. Someone had written it, or something. Mark tried to convince himself it was a prank from the previous owners, but something about the letters, uneven and jagged, didn't feel right. That night, sleep was elusive. Every creak and groan of the house felt amplified. Mark dreamed of the basement, endless stairs descending into darkness, whispers curling from the shadows. At one point he woke suddenly, convinced he heard scratching noises beneath his bedroom floor. The next morning, Mark went back down with gloves and cleaner, determined to erase the message. As he scrubbed, the wall seemed to pulse, or maybe it was just his imagination. When the paint finally peeled away, nothing was underneath but bare concrete, rough and mottled. But then he noticed it, a narrow crack in the wall behind the workbench, just wide enough for a hand. Mark knelt and peered in. Darkness stared back. Curiosity gnawed at him. Over the next few days, he cleared the basement, pulling boxes and junk outside, digging around the crack with a screwdriver. One afternoon, a small wooden panel popped loose, revealing a hidden cavity within the wall. Inside was a faded, leather-bound journal. The pages were brittle but readable. Mark's heart pounded as he flipped through it. The handwriting was cramped and hurried. The journal belonged to a man named Elias Harper, who had lived in the house nearly a century earlier. Where Elias wrote of strange noises in the basement, voices calling his name, footsteps echoing when no one was there. He described a small door concealed behind the wall, a door he believed led to something alive. The entries grew darker, obsessed. Elias spoke of nightmares where shadows moved on their own and of a presence watching from the depths. He mentioned a hidden cellar below the basement floor, sealed off long ago. Mark's skin prickled as he read the last entry. "Tonight I descend. The house hides a secret darker than the night. If I do not return, let this journal be a warning. Do not open the door. Do not look." A sudden noise startled Mark. He looked up, heart hammering. A faint scraping came from beneath the floorboards, just beyond the workbench. He took a deep breath and stepped over. The concrete floor was cracked and uneven. Kneeling, he found a rusted metal ring embedded in the center of a square slab. With a grunt, Mark pulled. The slab shifted slightly, then stuck fast. After several tries, it gave way with a groan. Below, a narrow, rough-hewn staircase descended into absolute darkness. The air wafting up was cold, musty, thick with the scent of earth and something metallic. Mark's flashlight beam trembled as he shone it down the stairs. They vanished after 10 steps, swallowed by shadow. He hesitated. A rational part of him screamed to close the slab and call it a night. But something deeper, curiosity, maybe desperation, drew him down. His footsteps echoed on stone. The narrow stairway opened into a small chamber. The walls were damp, carved from rough stone. In the center was a pit, a gaping hole descending beyond the light's reach. Mark felt eyes on him, though nothing was visible. The air was electric, charged with something ancient and restless. As he approached the edge, a faint whisper curled up the walls. It was a voice, fractured and soft, calling his name. Mark, Mark. He stumbled back, heart pounding. The voice was close, too close. Suddenly, a cold hand brushed his ankle. Mark's scream caught in his throat as he spun around. There was nothing. Panicked, he scrambled back up the stairs, slamming the slab shut behind him. For nights afterward, Mark couldn't sleep. The basement door seemed to creak open by itself, the faint whispers following him like a shadow. One evening, he decided to set up a camera down there. He wanted proof. Maybe it was rats or the house settling. He positioned the camera near the workbench, pointed at the crack in the wall. When he checked the footage the next day, his blood ran cold. For hours, the basement sat empty. Then at midnight, a faint glow appeared near the hidden panel. The camera's night vision picked out a figure, thin, pale, and impossibly tall. Its eyes were black voids, reflecting no light. The figure reached out with impossibly long fingers toward the camera. Mark shut the laptop, hands shaking. He called a local historian who specialized in the town's old houses. The historian told him the house had a dark past, unmarked graves nearby, disappearances, rumors of occult rituals performed in the cellar. Mark decided he had to leave. Packing hastily, he prepared to abandon the house. But that night, as he loaded his car, he heard it, low chanting, coming from the basement. He ran back inside, heart hammering. The basement door was wide open, the room bathed in an eerie, flickering red light. He descended the stairs slowly, calling out. The chamber below was empty, except for the pit. From its depths came a low, guttural growl, vibrating through the stone. Mark stumbled back, falling hard. As he looked up, the walls seemed to pulse, alive with shadow. The voice whispered again, closer this time, filling the room. Stay. Mark fled the house, never looking back. Days later, police investigated. The basement was empty, no signs of ritual or recent disturbance except the slab over the cellar, which was sealed shut. Mark never returned. Years later, new owners reported strange noises, flickering lights, and cold spots in the basement. Neighbors claimed the house was cursed, that something old and angry lived beneath it. Mark's story is buried in local lore, dismissed as a cautionary tale. But sometimes on quiet nights, if you stand near the basement window, you can hear whispers carried on the wind, calling out from the depths, warning you not to look. Story the end. The first time I realized something was wrong with the basement was on a late autumn evening. I had just moved into the small house on the outskirts of town, a place I found through a local listing, cheap enough for a recent college grad starting a new job. The house itself was nothing spectacular. Old wood floors creaking underfoot, faded wallpaper peeling at the corners, and a basement door at the far end of the kitchen that I had barely noticed until then. It was getting dark outside, the kind of dim orange light that comes just before dusk fully settles, when I heard a noise coming from down there. It was faint, something like a soft scrape or a thud, but what really caught my attention was the faint smell of damp earth mixed with something else. Something metallic, maybe. I told myself it was probably the house settling, or maybe a raccoon trap somewhere, but there was a nagging feeling in my gut. The basement was a stubborn part of the house. The door was heavy, wooden, painted shut, but with enough effort I pried it open. The stairs were narrow and steep, coated with a thick layer of dust. I flicked the light switch, but the bulb only flickered weakly, casting uneven shadows on the walls that seemed to stretch and shift. I noticed the air smelled colder down here, damper, and the floor was rough concrete, cracked in places. I was only here to check the fuse box and grab some old tools that the landlord had left behind, but as I stood at the bottom of the stairs, something deep inside me told me to move carefully. The walls were lined with pipes that groaned faintly with the house's settling. At the far end was a door, a small, metal door I hadn't noticed from above. It was locked with a rusted padlock. I tried the handle. It didn't budge. Days passed, and the noises from the basement continued. Soft knocks, sometimes in rhythmic patterns, 3 taps, 2 taps, 4 taps, always at night, always when the house was otherwise silent. At first, I thought it was just the pipes or the wind pushing through cracks, but then I started noticing other things. My keys, which I always left on the kitchen counter, would be found in odd places, sometimes by the basement door, sometimes near the back steps. I chalked it up to absent-mindedness, but the feeling that I wasn't alone in the house kept growing. One night, I was woken by the distinct sound of footsteps on the basement stairs. They were slow, deliberate, each step echoing softly. I sat up, heart pounding. I switched on my phone's flashlight and crept to the door, but the footsteps stopped. When I looked down the hallway toward the basement, the door was closed. The next day, I told the landlord about the noises. He avoided eye contact and said, "That basement's been a problem for years. Used to be part of an old workshop or something. We sealed off the back room decades ago after some incidents. Best not to go poking around." "Incidents?" I asked, but he just shook his head and changed the subject. Curiosity gnawed at me. I started researching the house's history at the local library. Old newspapers revealed a string of strange disappearances in the neighborhood dating back 40 years. One article mentioned a man named Harold Reynolds, a reclusive tinkerer who lived in the house and was rumored to be involved in occult practices. The final report said he vanished without a trace and his home was abandoned for years afterward. That night, the knocking started again, this time louder, more insistent. I sat frozen on the couch, listening as the taps turned to scraping, as if someone or something was clawing at the basement door. In the early hours of the morning, I finally mustered the courage to approach the basement. The air grew colder with every step I took down. At the bottom, the flickering light barely illuminated the space, but I saw that the padlock on the metal door was broken open, lying on the floor in pieces. I hesitated, then pushed the door slowly. Beyond it was a small, claustrophobic room, its walls covered with symbols scratched into the concrete, circles, triangles, and strange, twisting lines. There were old, rusted tools scattered on the floor, some stained with what looked like dried blood. A foul stench rose from the corner. I looked down and saw a shallow pit dug into the dirt floor. Inside were fragments of old bones and tattered cloth. Suddenly, a cold gust slammed the door shut behind me. I lunged for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers began then, low, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from every direction. My phone flickered and died. I pounded on the door until my knuckles bled. The whispers grew louder, turning into anguished cries. My breath came in ragged gasps as the shadows in the room twisted and writhed, forming shapes that seemed almost human. Time lost meaning. Hours? Minutes? I don't know. When the door finally creaked open, I scrambled out, dizzy and disoriented. I never returned to the basement. Within days, I packed my things and moved out, unable to shake the feeling that whatever haunted that place had marked me. I still wake up sometimes, hearing faint scratching beneath my floorboards, and I wonder what happens to the souls trapped in that dark pit, waiting for someone foolish enough to let them out again. Story the end. The first time I noticed something was off about the basement, it was late October, and the leaves outside my new house in Cleveland were already turning that rusty, brittle shade of orange. I had just moved in a few days earlier, eager to start fresh after a messy breakup and a string of dead-end jobs. The house was an old two-story built sometime in the 1950s, the kind of place that had character, if you could overlook the peeling paint and creaky floorboards. The basement door was in the corner of the kitchen. It was an old, heavy wooden door with a rusted latch and a small glass window near the top, fogged with age. I hadn't gone down there much yet, just once or twice to check for the circuit breakers or grab some boxes I'd stored. But there was always this stale, musty smell that stuck to my clothes when I came back up. That first night after moving in, I was lying in bed around 2 a.m. when I heard it. A faint thump from below. It was so subtle at first that I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it. The kind of noise you think you hear when you're half asleep but can't quite pin down. Then I heard it again, this time a little louder and more deliberate. Thump. Thump. Like footsteps, but slow, dragging. I told myself it was just the old house settling or maybe a raccoon or something outside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was coming from the basement. Over the next week, the noises became more frequent and louder. Not just thumping, but scraping sounds, like something heavy being dragged across the concrete floor. Sometimes I'd hear scratching, slow and methodical, as if claws or nails were gouging at the walls or floor. I started to avoid going down there alone. One afternoon, I found the basement door cracked open, even though I was sure I had locked it. Milo, my black cat, was sitting near the stairs, staring down into the darkness with his fur puffed up and tail twitching anxiously. Milo was normally fearless and affectionate, but he refused to go near the basement after that night. That made me more uneasy than I wanted to admit. I decided to investigate properly. I bought a sturdy flashlight, a baseball bat, and a small camera to record anything strange. On a rainy Sunday afternoon, I forced myself down the stairs. The air was thick, cold, and smelled like old earth and rusted metal. The concrete floor was damp in places, and the bare walls were stained with dark patches of mold. I shined the light around and noticed something I hadn't before: a door built into the far wall, almost blending in with the stone. It was smaller than the main door and had no handle, just a rusted iron ring hanging loosely. Curious, I pulled at the ring, and the door creaked open with a sound like a groan. Behind it was a narrow crawlspace that plunged into deeper darkness. I hesitated, but felt compelled to see what was inside. I crawled through the tunnel a few feet, the walls slick with moisture, the smell getting worse, like something decayed, rotten, and metallic all at once. Then I felt it. A sudden chill, like a breath on the back of my neck. The hairs on my arms stood up. A faint whisper brushed my ears. Soft, desperate, barely audible. Help me. I spun around, heart pounding, and scrambled back out of the tunnel, slamming the door behind me. That night, sleep was impossible. The whispers returned in my dreams, urgent and pleading. Sometimes I'd wake to the sound of scratching at the basement door or the faint dragging noise in the distance. Milo would stare at the door all night, ears perked and eyes wide as if waiting for something to come through. A few days later, I found deep claw marks on the inside of the basement door, jagged and fresh. I hadn't heard any footsteps, so they must have been made by something else. Panicked, I started researching the house history. The previous owner, it turned out, was a reclusive man named Harold, who'd lived there alone for decades. Neighbors said he was a bit odd, keeping to himself and never inviting anyone over. Some whispered he was involved in strange rituals, though no one had any proof. I found a faded newspaper clipping from the early 1970s detailing a missing person case, a young woman who vanished without a trace. Her last known address was the house next door to mine, and Harold was the prime suspect, though he was never charged. The basement was remodeled sometime in the late 70s, but the small door and tunnel were never mentioned. It was as if they were deliberately concealed. That night, the atmosphere in the house grew heavier. The air was thick and oppressive, like the walls themselves were closing in. I sat in the living room with every light on, trying to ignore the noises from below. Suddenly, the basement door slammed open, echoing through the silent house. I ran to it, bat raised, but saw nothing. The crawlspace door was wide open. Inside, I found muddy footprints, small and uneven, like someone had been crawling back and forth. The whispers were louder now, sometimes calling my name, sometimes crying in anguish. I called a local priest to bless the house. He was an older man with deep-set eyes who looked genuinely unsettled when he stepped into the basement. He refused to enter the crawlspace and warned me that something malevolent lingered there, something bound long ago, but restless now. After the blessing, things didn't get better. The noises became more frequent, more intense. I heard footsteps pacing the basement floor for hours. Doors creaked open and closed by themselves. Objects moved inexplicably. One night, Milo vanished. I searched everywhere, the basement, the yard, the neighborhood, but he was gone. The final straw came when I woke to a cold hand gripping my ankle. I screamed and flicked the light on to find nothing but empty air. But on my leg, there were deep scratches, bleeding and fresh. I packed my things and left the house that morning, never looking back. Months later, I still dream of the basement, the whispers, and the crawl space, and sometimes, late at night, I hear the faintest scratching at my apartment door. Story the end. The old house had been in my family for generations. It stood at the end of a winding country road, nestled among dense woods and fields that stretched farther than the eye could see. When my parents inherited it from my grandfather, they decided to move there for a fresh start away from the city's chaos. I was 18 at the time, caught between the end of high school and the uncertainty of what came next. The house was charming, but worn, filled with creaky floors, faded wallpaper, and that unmistakable scent of aged wood and dust. The basement, though, was a different story entirely. The basement was vast, cold, and unfinished. Its concrete walls were stained with moisture, and the air smelled of damp earth and something else I couldn't place, something faintly metallic and sour. It was dimly lit by a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, flickering intermittently. The wooden stairs leading down groaned under the weight of every step, and shadows clung stubbornly to every corner. My parents used the space to store old furniture, boxes filled with forgotten belongings, and the furnace that rumbled quietly in the far corner. None of us ever spent much time down there, especially after dark. I didn't pay much attention to the basement at first. It was just a place you passed through to do laundry or fetch a storage box. But soon enough, I started noticing things. Small, subtle things that unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. The first time it happened, I was coming home late from a friend's house. The house was dark and quiet. As I opened the basement door to get some firewood stored down there, I heard a faint tapping sound from below, like fingernails drumming slowly on wood. I froze, my hand on the door handle, listening. The sound stopped. I shook my head and told myself it was probably just the house settling or a loose piece of wood. But the feeling stayed with me, that prickling sense of being watched. Over the next few weeks, those strange sounds grew more frequent. The tapping would come and go at odd hours, sometimes accompanied by scraping or low, guttural murmurs I couldn't make out. I asked my parents if they heard anything, but they shrugged it off as normal house noises or maybe raccoons in the walls. One afternoon, my curiosity got the better of me. I decided to spend some time in the basement, trying to figure out where the noises came from. I grabbed a flashlight and went down the creaky stairs. The cold air hit me immediately, and the musty smell was stronger than usual. I swept the light over the cluttered shelves and boxes. The floor was damp in patches, and the walls bore cracks and dark stains. I moved toward the far corner, where the noises seemed to concentrate. That's when I saw it. Behind an old, rotting bookshelf was a narrow door, not a window or a typical cellar door, but a small panel about the size of a child's doorway, framed in old wood and barely hanging on its hinges. I had never noticed it before. I reached out and pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, revealing a dark crawl space barely big enough to fit through. I shone my flashlight inside. The beam illuminated rough dirt walls and a patch of disturbed earth. The tapping stopped instantly. For a moment there was silence, so complete I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then a whisper, soft, breathy, almost a sigh. The voice was too faint to understand, but it filled me with dread. I pulled the door shut and ran back up the stairs, heart racing. That night, I couldn't sleep. The whisper echoed in my mind, and every creak in the house sounded like footsteps. The next day, I told my parents about the hidden door. My dad laughed it off as just an old storage space or maybe a ventilation shaft, but my mom looked uneasy. She said she'd never seen it before. Days passed and the basement seemed to grow colder. The lights flickered more often. My parents started hearing things too. Doors closing, footsteps pacing, whispers just beyond comprehension. One evening, my mom woke me, trembling. She said she had seen a shadow moving down in the basement when she went to check on the furnace. The shadow was tall and hunched, with long, claw-like fingers that dragged along the wall. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew otherwise. We decided to call a professional, a contractor to inspect the basement for structural issues, pests, or anything else. When he arrived, the man was quiet and serious. He spent hours examining every corner, every inch of the crawl space behind the hidden door. At the end of the day, he looked pale. "There's something down there," he said finally, voice low. "Something that shouldn't be." He refused to say more. That night, the worst happened. I woke to a crashing sound from downstairs. The basement door was wide open, swinging on its hinges like it had been thrown. I heard scraping, slow, deliberate, dragging along the concrete floor. I grabbed my phone and flashlight and crept down the stairs. The basement was empty, except for a trail of wet, dark stains leading from the crawlspace door. I followed it, every step heavier than the last. Inside the crawlspace, the air was thick and cold. The dirt floor was torn up, with deep gouges and claw marks all around. In the center was a small pile of bones, animal at first glance, but something about them was off. Too many, too small, arranged in a pattern like a grotesque offering. As I backed out, I heard the whisper again, closer now, urgent, pleading. The voice was not human. It was a chorus of hisses and growls, layered together like a nightmare. I slammed the crawlspace door shut and ran upstairs. For days, the house was unbearable. The basement seemed alive with movement. My parents refused to go down there. I started sleeping with a hammer by my bed. One night, the power went out completely. In the pitch black, I heard a voice call my name from the basement. I didn't answer. The next morning, I found the basement door nailed shut from the outside. My parents decided to sell the house quickly, unwilling to live with whatever lurked beneath. Before they left, I snuck down to the basement one last time. The crawlspace door was broken open. The dirt floor was freshly disturbed, and in the center, a single bone lay on the ground. A human finger. I left that house behind and never looked back. Years later, I learned the property had been the site of a long-forgotten cult, rumored to have performed dark rituals in the basement. The crawlspace was a sealed pit used for sacrifices. Sometimes I still wake up hearing that whisper, calling me back. The basement never let me go. Story, the end. It started with the house. I had just accepted a new job in a small town in rural Indiana, and looking for a place to live on a budget, I found an old 2-story farmhouse for rent on the outskirts of town. The landlord was an elderly man who seemed eager to get someone in the house quickly. The rent was low, too low for the condition of the place, but I was desperate and willing to overlook things that would have raised red flags under normal circumstances. The house was definitely old, probably built in the early 1900s. It creaked with every step and smelled faintly of damp wood and old smoke. The kitchen had outdated appliances, and the walls were thin enough that you could hear the neighbors' dogs barking late into the night. The basement, however, was the thing that unsettled me from day one. The basement door was a heavy wooden slab with peeling paint and rusted hinges, located in the corner of the kitchen. The landlord warned me not to spend much time down there. He said it was mostly storage and that the humidity could cause mold problems. "Don't go down there unless you have to," he told me with a tight smile. At first, I took his advice. I only went down when I needed to do laundry or check the fuse box. The basement was dark, cold, and cramped, with stone walls and dirt floors covered in patches of cracked concrete. The air was heavy with the smell of mildew and something else I couldn't identify, something faint but persistent, like a mix of decay and iron. The first strange thing happened about a week after I moved in. I was folding laundry near the washing machine when I heard faint tapping sounds coming from the far corner of the basement. At first, I thought it was just the pipes or the old furnace, but the tapping was rhythmic, deliberate almost, like a slow knock. I froze, listening. The basement was so silent that the tapping echoed slightly. I called out, "Hello?" But there was no answer. The tapping stopped as suddenly as it had started. I told myself it was probably a rat or some other animal moving behind the walls. That night, I dreamed of the basement. I saw a small, pale figure sitting on the floor in the shadows, rocking back and forth. When I looked closer, I realized the figure had no face, only a smooth, featureless surface where its face should have been. I woke up in a cold sweat. The next day, I decided to clean out the basement a bit. I wanted to make it less scary, less foreign. As I moved boxes and old furniture, I noticed scratch marks along the base of the far wall, near where I had heard the tapping. The scratches were deep and jagged, like someone had clawed at the stone desperately. I traced my fingers over them and shivered. Later, I found old newspapers tucked behind a loose stone in the wall. They dated back to the 1920s and told the story of a local family that had vanished without a trace, leaving behind a young daughter named Mary. I read the articles late into the night, feeling a growing unease. A few nights after that, the tapping returned, louder this time. accompanied by soft crying that seemed to come from beneath the floorboards. I told myself it was all in my head, but I stopped going down there alone. One evening, the power went out in the house. The entire block was dark except for a few houses down the road. I went to check the fuse box in the basement, flashlight in hand. As I descended the stairs, the temperature dropped sharply, and the air grew thick and damp. The crying was louder now, echoing around me. Near the far wall, I saw a faint outline of something on the ground. A small, dirt-covered doll lay half buried in the dust. As I reached down to pick it up, a sudden, icy hand grasped my ankle from behind. I screamed and stumbled upstairs, slamming the basement door shut. For the next week, I barely slept. I installed new locks on the basement door and tried to avoid going down there at all. But the house seemed to have a life of its own. Doors would creak open on their own, lights flickered, and at night, the whispering voices returned. Sometimes I could make out words, pleas for help, names I didn't recognize, and the constant refrain, "Let me out." One morning, I found the basement door unlocked, even though I was sure I had locked it. I went downstairs cautiously and discovered fresh scratch marks on the wooden door, deep and bloody. That was when I realized I wasn't alone. I called the landlord, who reluctantly told me the basement had a history of strange occurrences dating back decades. He warned me that the previous tenant had fled suddenly, and nobody had lived there since. Desperate, I called a local priest to bless the house. During the blessing, he became visibly disturbed when he reached the basement. He told me that he felt a dark presence trapped beneath the house, something that had been confined there for a very long time. He advised me to leave the house immediately and never return. I did. After I moved out, I learned that the house had been the site of an old, abandoned well, sealed off long ago, where a young girl had been accidentally trapped and died. The land had been built up around it without anyone realizing the horror buried beneath. I never went back, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear tapping on my windows and faint whispers in the wind. I can't shake the feeling that whatever was in that basement followed me home. Story the end. It was a chilly November evening when I first noticed something off about the basement in the house I had just moved into. I'd inherited the place from my late uncle, a man I barely knew but who had always been a little eccentric. The house was old, Victorian style, sitting at the edge of town, and that seemed kind of place that seemed frozen in time. The basement door was tucked away in the back hallway, behind a narrow wooden door painted the same faded cream color as the walls. It was heavy, creaky, and the rusty lock had to be twisted twice before it would budge. The basement was mostly empty except for some old furniture, a chest of drawers with peeling paint, and a few cardboard boxes covered in decades of dust. It smelled musty, of damp earth and mildew, and the only light came from a bare bulb that flickered occasionally. I didn't spend much time down there at first, just storing a few things and trying to ignore the chill that seemed to linger. But then the noises started. It was subtle at first, a faint tapping on the walls like fingernails scratching at the concrete. At night, I'd hear it coming from beneath the floorboards, sometimes from the corner where the furnace sat. The sounds were irregular, sometimes a single knock, other times a series of sharp raps. I told myself it was probably the house settling or some stray animal trapped somewhere. One night, I woke up to a different sound entirely. Breathing. Slow, labored, and wet, almost like someone struggling to draw air through a constricted throat. It was coming from below me, under the floor. I lay frozen, staring at the ceiling, feeling a cold sweat break over my body. When I finally mustered the courage to get up and check, the sound was gone. I began to dread going near the basement door, especially after dark. The air around it seemed heavier, almost suffocating. The lights in the basement flickered randomly, sometimes going out entirely, plunging the space into complete darkness. I started leaving the door locked at night, even when I needed to access storage. One evening, I noticed that the lock on the basement door had been tampered with. The rusted latch was bent, the screws loose. Someone, or something, had tried to get in. I called the police, but there was no evidence of forced entry anywhere else in the house. The officers chalked it up to a faulty lock or a prankster from the neighborhood. But I knew better. The next night, I set up a small camera aimed at the basement stairs. I didn't expect to catch anything, but I was desperate for answers. When I reviewed the footage the next morning, my stomach dropped. At exactly 2:47 a.m., the basement door creaked open slowly, as if pushed by an invisible hand. The light bulb flickered on and off erratically. Then a shadowy figure appeared at the bottom of the stairs, hunched, with long limbs and a face that was too pale to be human. It didn't move much, just stood there watching, breathing heavily. Then, without warning, it vanished. I didn't sleep for days after that. The scratching turned into something worse, something more urgent and violent. At times, I heard screams muffled by walls and the sound of chains dragging across the floor. My own reflection in the basement window seemed distorted, warped, as if something was trying to reach through. One afternoon, I found a trapdoor beneath a loose floorboard in the basement corner. It was hidden behind the chest of drawers. I pried it open, revealing a narrow staircase descending even further into the earth. The air coming from below was colder, thicker, smelling of decay and old blood. With trembling hands, I descended the stairs. The passage was cramped and dark. At the bottom, I found a small, windowless room, the walls covered in strange symbols, painted in what looked like dried blood. There were chains bolted to the floor and walls, some still stained with rust and what I hoped was just old grime. Scattered across the floor were bones, small, brittle fragments that crumbled when touched. Suddenly, a cold breeze swept through the room and the door slammed shut behind me. I fumbled with the handle, but it was stuck. Then the breathing started again, slow, wet, and close. I turned toward the sound, and in the corner I saw the same pale figure from the footage. Its eyes glowed faintly red in the dark. I screamed and pounded on the door. After what felt like an eternity, it opened, and I scrambled out, locking the trapdoor behind me. I left the basement and the house that night and never returned. The police found evidence of the hidden chamber and the bones, but no trace of the figure. Neighbors said the previous owner was involved in dark rituals and disappeared without a trace years ago. Now, living in an apartment far away, I still hear the scratching sometimes, and the breathing haunts my dreams. Whatever it was down there, it's still waiting, and sometimes I fear it's coming for me. Story, the end. The day I moved into the old house on Maple Street, I felt an uneasy chill, though it was the middle of August. The sun was still high, the air warm and sticky, but the house, built in the early 1900s, a squat brick structure with creeping ivy strangling the facade, seemed to suck the light from around it. I was desperate for a place to call my own after the sudden breakup and the months of couch surfing, and this house was affordable. Too affordable, maybe, but I ignored the warning signs. The landlord handed me the keys with a half-hearted smile and said, "Just don't go into the basement unless you have to. The door's old and the stairs are steep. Electrical issues, too." I nodded, eager to get inside and start fresh. The basement door sat at the back of the kitchen, a heavy wooden slab with peeling white paint and a brass knob dulled by age. For the first few days, I kept my distance from it. I unpacked boxes, arranged furniture, and tried to ignore the faint odor of damp earth and something else I couldn't place. The house was old. That was to be expected, right? But then I started hearing the noises. At night, when the house settled, I'd catch the faintest sounds. A scrape, a thud, a soft tapping. Sometimes the taps were rhythmic, 3 or 4 in a row, then silence. I chalked it up to rodents or the pipes. The landlord's words about electrical problems made me wary of the basement lights, so I kept the door firmly shut. One evening I was making dinner when the smell hit me again, stronger this time. A sour, almost metallic stench coming from beneath my feet. I knelt by the basement door, pressing my ear to it, and heard the faintest scrape on the other side. Heart pounding, I stepped back. The next day, I tried to find the landlord, but no answer. I thought about calling a handyman to check the basement, but my budget was tight. Besides, what could be so wrong down there? I avoided the door as much as I could, but the strange noises grew louder and more frequent. On the third night, I woke up 2:13 a.m. to the sound of slow, heavy footsteps on the stairs. They echoed up through the floorboards beneath my bed. I lay frozen, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the footsteps to stop. They didn't. They reached the top of the stairs, paused, then retreated. After a few minutes, a low, guttural whisper floated up through the vent near my head. "Help me." The voice was barely audible, but it was unmistakably human and desperate. I grabbed my phone and recorded the whispers, shaking. The next morning, I played the recording back. The voice was clearer, repeating a name I couldn't quite make out. I showed the clip to my coworker, Lisa, who suggested I call the police if I felt unsafe. Reluctantly, I did. 2 officers came by that evening. They were polite but skeptical. They checked the basement door, which I unlocked for them. The stairs creaked under their weight, the faint light flickering as they descended. They came back after a few minutes, reporting no signs of forced entry, no one hiding. "Old houses make noises," one officer said. "Maybe your imagination." I wanted to believe them. But that night, the whispers returned, louder and closer, this time calling my name. Days later, I finally gathered the courage to go into the basement myself. I took a flashlight, a crowbar, and my phone. The basement air was cold and heavy, thick with dust and mildew. The concrete walls were cracked and stained. At the far end was a smaller door I hadn't noticed before, painted a dull gray with peeling edges and an old padlock hanging loose. I pried the lock open. The door creaked wide to reveal a narrow crawl space, just tall enough to sit in. Inside, the walls were covered in scratched symbols, circles, lines, strange runes I didn't recognize. On the floor were bits of torn fabric, broken glass, and what looked disturbingly like dried bloodstains. A cold draft blew out from the crawl space, carrying a faint whisper. "Please." My skin crawled. I backed out and slammed the door shut. The padlock, which I'd tossed on the floor, suddenly clanged loudly, echoing in the confined space. My heart raced as I scrambled up the stairs. That night, sleep eluded me. I sat in the living room with every light on, the TV blaring to drown out the silence. Then at precisely 3:03 a.m., the basement door creaked open on its own. I was certain of it. I stared at it, frozen with fear, as it slowly swung wider, revealing darkness beyond. A shape emerged from the shadows, tall and thin, face obscured. It whispered my name again, closer this time. I couldn't move or scream. The figure reached out a pale hand. Suddenly, my phone rang, breaking the trance. The figure vanished. I answered it, voice trembling. "Leave the house," said the landlord's voice, harsh and urgent. "Now. You don't know what you've unleashed." I didn't wait for another word. I grabbed my essentials and fled, leaving the basement door wide open behind me. I never returned. Later, I learned the house was built on land with a dark history, stories of disappearances, occult rituals, and a man who vanished inside that very basement decades ago. Sometimes when I'm alone in my new apartment, I hear faint tapping at the walls, soft whispers just beyond hearing, and the cold chill of something watching from the shadows. Story the end. There are a few things you can get used to when you live in an old house, but the sound of footsteps coming from the basement when you're home alone is not one of them. I moved into my uncle's old place in Reading, Pennsylvania after he passed away in late 2022. He had no kids and left me the house in his will, probably because I was the only family member who visited him after his stroke. The place was built in the 1920s. Creaky floors, rust-colored pipes, and a smell of damp wood that never really went away no matter how much air freshener I sprayed. My friends all joked about the creepy murder basement the first time they visited. It had a steep, narrow staircase and a low ceiling that you had to duck under in parts. The walls were unfinished cinder blocks with spider webs thick enough to look like insulation. There was a single dangling bulb in the center that barely lit up half the room, and when it was on, you could still see darker corners moving as if the shadows were breathing. I didn't go down there often, only when I needed to check the circuit breaker or grab old tools. But strange things started happening about a month after I moved in. It began with small things. Items I stored on the main floor would go missing, only to show up on the basement steps. I'd leave a screwdriver in the kitchen drawer and find it lying on the 4th step down the next day. A roll of tape vanished from my desk, and I found it unwound and stuck to the bottom stair rail. At first, I thought I was just misplacing things. Maybe I was sleepwalking. I laughed it off to coworkers, but the joke stopped being funny after what happened in mid-March. I'd been working from home late into the night, buried in tax paperwork. Around 2 a.m., I heard a distinct thud coming from below. It wasn't loud, but it was heavy, like something solid falling. I froze. The house had its normal creaks, but This was different. It sounded deliberate. I got up and opened the basement door, flipping the switch at the top. The bulb flickered for a second and then went out. Just silence. I stood there, peering down into the dark, waiting to hear another sound. Nothing. The next morning, I went down with a flashlight. There was a wooden chair in the middle of the basement. I hadn't brought any furniture down there. There were just tools, paint cans, and junk boxes from my uncle's time. The chair had deep scratch marks on the seat, like someone had been clawing at it. At first, I thought maybe it came from the attic, but when I went up to check, all the chairs were accounted for. That same week, I started locking the basement door. I didn't have a good reason for it, but something about leaving it open made me feel exposed. The lock made a soft click that gave me peace of mind at night. But a few nights later, I found the door wide open in the morning. Not just unlocked, actually swung open. I remember vividly locking it before bed because I had to jiggle the key to get it to catch. That night, I moved a heavy toolbox in front of the door. If it opened again, I'd hear it being shoved. Around 4:17 a.m., I heard it. Shh! The metal legs of the toolbox dragged across the wood floor just outside my bedroom. I bolted upright in bed, heart slamming against my chest. I wasn't imagining that. I got up, heart pounding in my ears, and stepped into the hall. The toolbox was halfway across the floor, and the basement door stood open. But there was no sound, no one on the stairs. Nothing but darkness yawning into that gaping black square. I slept with a knife under my pillow that night. Not that I expected to use it, I just needed to feel like I could. I called a locksmith the next day and had the door reinforced with a deadbolt. I also installed a motion sensor light and a camera just above the door frame. If someone or something was messing with me, I wanted evidence. That weekend, I didn't leave the house. I stayed up all night with the feed open on my laptop, waiting. For 2 nights, nothing happened. Then Sunday night, around 3:40 a.m., the motion sensor light came on. The door didn't open, but the camera picked something up. I almost dropped my laptop when I saw it. There was a shape, human-sized, but not quite right. Blurry, like static wrapped in a coat. It just stood at the bottom of the stairs, unmoving for almost a full minute. Then the light flicked off. I rewound the video dozens of times, trying to sharpen the shape, but it looked like a mess of distortion, like old analog static. And just before the light shut off, it looked like the shape turned its head upward, toward the camera. I couldn't sleep after that. I started crashing on my friend Ricky's couch a few nights a week, telling him the place just gave me the creeps. I didn't go into the basement for over a month, but ignoring it didn't help. The final straw was the voice. I had just gotten out of the shower one night, towel around my waist, when I heard a whisper. At first I thought it was a draft through the vents, but it was too coherent. I crept down the hallway, listening. The whispering stopped as I got closer to the basement door. Then, clear as day, I heard my name, Eli. It was soft, breathy, as if it had been spoken through clenched teeth. My spine locked. I didn't open the door. I just stood there, staring at the knob, feeling something beyond it waiting, aware of me. That night, I slept in my car in a Walmart parking lot. I reached out to my cousin Lydia, who's into paranormal stuff. She's a medium or empath or something, one of those titles people use to describe being sensitive to energies. I was skeptical, but I was also desperate. She came over with a satchel full of herbs and candles. She didn't laugh when I told her what I'd seen or heard. She just nodded like she expected it. As soon as she stepped into the basement, she said, "Something's trapped here." I followed her down. The flashlight beam danced across the room. There was a smell I hadn't noticed before, wet soil and something metallic like blood. She lit a bundle of sage and muttered something under her breath. Then she turned to me, face pale. "There's a presence here, Eli. It's not a ghost. It's older. Feeds on fear. This isn't human." I asked her what I should do. "You can't bless it away. You can't reason with it. The best you can do is seal it in, reinforce the boundary, and leave it alone." We poured salt across the threshold and placed a mirror facing the stairwell, something she said would confuse it. She made me promise not to acknowledge it if I heard it again. Not to answer, not to speak to it. For a while it worked. Nothing moved, nothing whispered. The camera picked up nothing but stillness. I started sleeping in my own bed again. It felt almost normal. But a few weeks ago, I had to go into the basement. The breaker had tripped and half the house lost power. I stood at the top of the steps for a long time, heart in my throat. Then I forced myself down, flipping on the flashlight. I stepped into the room and the air felt thicker, heavier, like breathing through wool. I went to the breaker box, flipped the switch, and turned to leave. That's when I heard it again. Eli. But this time it wasn't behind me. It was above me. I looked up. Pressed against the ceiling, just above the light bulb, was a face. Pale, stretched too thin, the skin like melted wax. Its mouth was moving, but the sound was inside my head. I ran. I didn't look back. I nearly broke my ankle racing up the stairs. I slammed the door and nailed it shut. I moved out 2 days later. I don't care if I inherit 5 houses. I'll never live in another one with a basement. I never went back to get my things. I left everything. The new owners bought it cheap. I didn't leave a note. But every now and then at 3:40 a.m. I wake up for no reason, and sometimes I hear my name whispered from the floorboards below. Story the end.